Hello students, let's work on chapter 11. So hopefully you've read the chapter already, and we will go over a couple things because this is a lot on physical and cognitive development in early adulthood. So probably a lot of you are familiar with this time period. I think a majority of the students in the class are probably of this age in early adulthood. So let's talk about that transition from adolescence to adulthood. Then we'll talk about other aspects of physical development and some cognitive development. So, becoming an adult, we've talked about this before, how in the US there's not really a clear line of when someone has become an adult. Rituals in a lot of cultures and some religions in the US do a better job at really defining, like, now you have moved past adolescence or childhood and now you are an adult. So emerging adulthood is this phase. It's kind of a controversial phase in the field. Some researchers really hold on to it and say, yep, emerging adulthood is a good way to describe young adults. Others say, well, since it only really exists in Western cultures, it's not as good of a way to describe early adulthood because it doesn't fit the entire world. So either way, we can still look at it as a phenomenon or not, and look at early adulthood, which is kind of where I come at it from. I do read research with emerging adults, but I always look at it from the perspective of, okay, now what of these things might also translate to other people around the world, other early adults. And because context is important, things are going to be individual in any given culture. So while there might be things that, like early adulthood, that we can put a label on for the entire world, it's not bad to have more specific labels for specific cultures as well. So usually we think of emerging adulthood from about 18 to 25, and like we've said before, it's mostly in Western countries, so the US, Europe, Australia. So you could think of it as an extended adolescence with more experimentation, more exploration. You can see here a young person with a PhD coming back to live with family, with parents. They don't look maybe necessarily too happy about that. We'll actually talk about that when we get to middle adulthood and later adulthood, about some research on parents who have their adult children come back to live with them. So that'll be it's an interesting little tease for future lectures. So a lot of the time there's a lot of identity exploration here, and as we talked about recently, identity exploration continues to happen throughout adulthood. So emerging adulthood is in that time period where early adults are finding out their identity and testing out different things. So love, work, that kind of thing. Instability is a big factor here. So maybe not having a permanent full-time job, maybe having seasonal work or gig work, or multiple jobs that are part-time, that they might only work at one for, say, 7 months or so. So that kind of instability. So you can see how some of these things are due to the context of these countries and the capitalist system that exists for these young people to work in. Maybe they don't have their degree yet, and so they can't get that full-time position, so they're working multiple part-time things. So it's kind of defined by that context. So you can see how it could be useful to describe this as emerging adulthood. So for the people experiencing emerging adulthood, they often feel in between, like they're not sure if they're an adolescent or an adult. They're somewhere in between there. There's some things that they are adulting on, but some things that they might not be. So it's also a time where there are still a lot of possibilities. Since they have that little more flexibility, they have that option to maybe change career paths, change degrees. I know people who change their degree 4 or 5 times before they finished one of their degrees. So, and then people who finish a degree and do a job that's completely unrelated to it. So how can we support emerging adults? So whether this is a thing or not, there is research on what we can do to support emerging adults, and one of those is provide them with opportunities to be contributors. So that's in society in general, in a home, in a community, and that goes for adolescents as well. So you might see a lot of things that help for emerging adults also help for adolescents. So essentially give them responsibilities, let them have opportunities to do things. They are capable. So give candid, constructive, and quality feedback. So making sure it's clear what things that they can improve on, things that they need to work on. So if you're a mentor to someone, they're working on their writing, as an example, giving them really specific direction, like these are things you can work on, these are ways that you could do that. That can be really helpful. So create positive adult connections, so with relationships, with other adults, that kind of thing, and then challenge these people to become more competent in whatever kind of sphere they're working on. So markers of adulthood that we generally consider, so we talked about this a few chapters ago. What is the defining features? Generally, people think holding a full-time job is one defining feature, being economically independent, taking responsibility for yourself, and transitioning from maybe high school to college. So all these things put together, one individual piece might not say, well, now this person is an adult, but if you put all those together, that's a little more clear to most people that that person is now an adult. All right, so let's talk about physical growth in early adulthood. So peak physical performance for humans is usually between the ages of 19 and 26. So if you're within that range, congratulations. If you're before that range, well, you've got some more peak physical performance to look forward to. And if you're after that range, like me, well, then you can try to get those capacities back. That's still development, right? So muscle tone and strength begin to decline at around age 30. So with that, if that's something that's important to you, keeping up, doing more workouts, doing more exercising, watching your weight a little more, watching what you eat, becomes more and more important throughout the remainder of your life. So mortality is about 2 times higher than adolescence, so that's not great. And then some chronic health problems appear around this age. And I would say for some of these, they're not really it might just be that they're not diagnosed until this age. So things like multiple sclerosis is a lot more common in early adulthood to start seeing those symptoms and then be diagnosed. Fibromyalgia, it's really not clear that children or early adolescents have fibromyalgia, but it seems that maybe it's not really diagnosed until about early adulthood. And other chronic health problems are more common to see in early adulthood as well. So with this, early and emerging adults do more health compromising behaviors. They don't often consider how behaviors might have an impact on their adult health far down the line. And so part of this might be just their neurology. So it's in this time that brain has finished its myelination, so that goal setting, that planning, that looking ahead is not fully developed in its final form, I guess you could say, until about the age of 23, which is right here in the middle of early adulthood. So things like poor sleep schedules, not eating regular meals, some of these other contextual factors affect that too, right? If you're working 3 part-time jobs and they have a variety of schedules, you might have to sleep a certain amount of time one day and then a different block of time the other day, that kind of thing. So it's not all just because of their decisions, it might also be the context that they are in. So snacking is a main source of food. There's often more drinking and smoking at this age as well, and risky sexual behavior. So 34% of early adults are obese, and so those are numbers from, say, the US. So a much higher percentage than other developed countries. So not great. And that puts people at a higher risk of hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular problems, and other mental health issues. And this goes on into later adulthood as well. So working on diet at this point is really important. So factors that affect obesity, obviously heredity is a big one. So the way that your body stores fats and things is very heavily influenced by your genetics. Environmental factors as well, such as declines in exercise or activities, lower socioeconomic status. So you might have heard of things like food deserts, where you have less access to nutritious and healthy foods. So that affects it as well. So with dieting versus exercise, what is better? What should you do? Well, regular exercise is a thing that we've talked about exercise at essentially every age. So for young children, they're doing a lot of exercise every day, usually in the form of play, but early adults should also be doing a minimum of 30 minutes of aerobic exercise daily. So that's things like swimming, jogging, cycling. So finding something that they like and can stay motivated in is really important. Things that stimulate the heart and lungs are really important. So, and then that helps prevent a lot of chronic illnesses. So things like cardiovascular disease, which can be long lasting. So reducing screen time and replacing that with exercise. So I know, say for example, rather than just watching a show, you can maybe run on a treadmill and watch a show. I have some friends that do that. You can chart your progress. That I've found to be most helpful for me, to make sure that I'm charting, making sure I know, oh, I did work out the last 2 or 3 days, and I need a rest day, so on and so forth. So chart that, see if your weights are going up or down when you're lifting weights, if your pace is quickening. There's apps to track that, things like that. If you're getting more steps every day with things like fitness trackers. So set goals for yourself and then work to meet those goals. Avoiding excuses, and find exercises that you enjoy. So also research says imagining alternatives can be helpful. So if that motivates you, go for that as well. So with that, eating and weight in early adulthood, we can see people who were successful at losing weight here when they just weighed themselves daily, when they planned meals, and then when they exercised 30 minutes a day. So planning meals and exercising is very useful, better than just weighing yourself. That doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but when you're doing these other things in addition, it helps a lot. All right, so let's jump forward to another health problem. So we talked about how a lot of early adults are doing more things like risky drug and alcohol use. So let's talk about addiction and what addiction is. So I'm just going to read some parts of this definition because these are really important. And I've got 2 different definitions here from different resources. So this is from the American Psychiatric Association. So addiction is a complex condition. It's a brain disease, which might not be how some people have thought of it. I know the lay kind of parlance about addiction is not that way, but it is a brain disease manifesting in compulsive substance use despite its harmful consequences. So people with addiction have a focus on that substance and it takes over their life. They keep using that even though they know it will cause problems. Another way to look at that is it is a treatable chronic medical disease involving a lot of brain neurology, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experience. So with that, they're engaging in behaviors that can become compulsive and harmful. So we've talked about neurology, we've talked about how brain circuitry forms habits, how it can be really hard to break those habits. Addiction is also problematic because with substance abuse, you're activating the neurons in different ways than might be natural. So you're getting more of various chemicals, whatever it is. It depends on what kind of substance is being used. Will increase those chemicals and the brain is altered function a little bit. That becomes a habit. So with that, prevention efforts and treatment approaches for addiction are really usually successful and generally as successful as those with other chronic diseases. So another chronic disease you might compare it to that wouldn't be inappropriate would be cardiovascular disease. So doing things daily to work on that cardiovascular disease, you can work to make that better over time. Same thing with addiction. It's another disease. It's affecting things in the brain as well as the rest of the body. So working on those symptoms daily, setting new habits and patterns, it is very treatable. So with that, early adults have diminished their drug and alcohol intake compared to adolescents. So they're intaking less on average, but binge drinking is really common in college. So what that's defined as is more than 5 drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks. So if, say, on a survey you were asked, have you had 5 drinks or more in a row in the past 2 weeks, that would be considered binge drinking. Extreme binge drinking is 10 to 15 drinks in a row in the last 2 weeks. And I saw my screen flicker. I'm not sure if you did. So I'm going to pause the video really quickly to make sure it is still recording. Everything looks fine, so let's continue. So extreme binge drinking again is 10 to 15 or more drinks in a row in the last 2 weeks. And I literally cannot imagine having that many drinks in a row. So this has been declining in recent years. So the trend over time is declining in binge drinking, but it still is a problem. It generally, for people, peaks between about ages 21 and 22 and then decreases over the lifespan. But as you can see here, binge drinking does continue on for a lot of people well into middle adulthood. So it is a health risk to binge drink. So, but with that, binge drinking does not necessarily mean that someone has an addiction. So let's jump back to talking about addiction. I feel like I should switch those slides around actually for future classes, so we can talk about addiction right after talking about addiction, rather than getting it confused with binge drinking. All right, so let's watch this about addiction being a disease and ways that we can treat it.
28 years ago, I was a broken man. And you're probably...
Sorry, I checked this video earlier and I was watching it at double speed, so that is too fast.
"28 years ago, I was a broken man. And you probably wouldn't be able to tell that if you met me. I had a good job at a well-respected academic institution. I dressed well, of course. But my insides were rotting away. You see, I grew up in a family riddled with addiction. And as a kid, I also struggled coming to terms with my own sexuality. And even though I couldn't name it then, growing up as a gay kid just compounded my issues of isolation and insecurities. But drinking took all of that away. Like many, I drank at an early age. I continued to drink my way through college. And when I finally did come out in the early 1980s, about the only places to meet other gay people, to socialize, to be yourself were gay bars. And what do you do in gay bars? You drink. And I did. A lot. My story is not unique. Like millions of Americans, my disease progressed undiagnosed. It took me to people and places and things that I never would have chosen. You know, and it wasn't until an intersection with the law gave me an opportunity to get care that I began my journey of recovery. And you know, my journey of recovery has been filled with love and with joy, but it hasn't been without pain. Like many of you, I've lost too many friends and family to this disease. I've heard too many heartbreaking stories of people who lost loved ones to addiction. And I've also lost countless friends to HIV and AIDS. You know, our current opioid epidemic and the AIDS epidemic tragically have much in common. Right now, we are in the midst of one of the greatest health crises of our time. During 2014 alone, 28,000 people died of drug overdoses associated with prescription drugs and heroin. During the 1980s, scores of people were dying for HIV and AIDS. Public officials ignored it. Some wouldn't even utter the words. They didn't want treatment. And tragically, there are many parallels with our current epidemic. Some called it the gay plague. They called for quarantines. They wanted to separate the innocent victims from the rest of us. I was afraid we were losing this battle because people were blaming us for being sick. Public policy was being held hostage by stigma and fear. And also held hostage were compassion, care, research, recovery, and treatment. But we changed all that. Because out of the pain of those deaths saw a social and political movement. AIDS galvanized us into action, to stand up, to speak up, and to act out. And it also galvanized the LGBT movement. We knew we were in a battle for our lives because silence equaled death. But we changed, and we made things happen. And right now, we have the potential to see the end of HIV and AIDS in our lifetime. These changes came in no small part by the courageous yet simple decision for people to come out to their neighbors, to their friends, to their families, and to their coworkers. Years ago, I was a volunteer for the NAMES Project. This was an effort started by Cleve Jones in San Francisco to show that people who died of AIDS had names and faces and families and people who loved them. I still recall unfolding the AIDS memorial quilt on the National Mall on a brilliant day in October 1988. So fast forward to 2015. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down the ban on same-sex marriage. My husband Dave and I walk over to the steps of the Supreme Court to celebrate that decision with so many other people. And I couldn't help but think how far we came around LGBT rights, and yet how far we needed to go around issues of addiction. When I was nominated by President Obama to be his director of drug policy, I was very open about my recovery and about the fact that I was a gay man. And at no point during my confirmation process, at least that I know of, did the fact that I was a gay man come to bear on my candidacy or my fitness to do this job. But my addiction did. At one point, a congressional staffer said that there was no way that I was going to be confirmed by the United States Senate because of my past. Despite the fact that I had been in recovery for over 20 years, and despite the fact that this job takes a little bit of knowledge around addiction. So, you know, this is the stigma that people with substance use disorders face every single day. And you know, I have to tell you, it's still why I'm still more comfortable coming out as a gay man than I am about a person with a history of addiction. Nearly every family in America is affected by addiction. Yet, unfortunately, too often, it's not talked about openly and honestly. It's whispered about. It's met with derision and scorn. We hear these stories time and time again on TV, online. We hear it from public officials, and we hear it from family and friends. You know, and those of us with an addiction, we hear those voices. And somehow we believe that we are less deserving of care and treatment. Today in the United States, only 1 in 9 people get care and treatment for their disorder. 1 in 9. Think about that. Generally, people with other diseases get care and treatment. If you have cancer, you get treatment. If you have diabetes, you get treatment. If you have a heart attack, you get emergency services and you get referred to care. But somehow people with addiction have to wait for treatment or often can't get it when they need it. And left untreated, addiction has significant dire consequences. And for many people, that means death or incarceration. We've been down that road before. For too long, our country felt like we could arrest our way out of this problem. But we know that we can't. Decades of scientific research has shown that this is a medical issue, that this is a chronic medical condition that people inherit and that people develop. So the Obama administration has taken a different tack on drug policy. We've developed and implemented a comprehensive plan to expand prevention services, treatment services, early intervention, and recovery support. We've pushed criminal justice reform. We've knocked down barriers to give people second chances. We see public health and public safety officials working hand in hand at the community level. We see police chiefs across the country guiding people to treatment instead of jail and incarceration. We see law enforcement, others, and other first responders reversing overdoses with naloxone to give people a second chance for care. The Affordable Care Act is the biggest expansion of substance use disorder treatment in a generation. And it also calls for the integration of treatment services within primary care. But fundamentally, all of this work is not enough. unless we change the way that we view people with addiction in the United States. You know, years ago when I finally understood that I had a problem and I knew that I needed help, I was too afraid to ask for it. I felt that people would think I was stupid, that I was weak-willed, that I was morally flawed. But I talk about my recovery because I want to make change. I want us to see that we need to be open and candid about who we are and what we can do. You know, I am public about my own recovery, not to be self-congratulatory. I am open about my own recovery to change public opinion, to change public policy, and to change the course of this epidemic and empower the millions of Americans who struggle with this journey to be open and candid about who they are. You know, people are more than their disease. And all of us have the opportunity to change public opinion and to change public policy. All of us know someone who has an addiction. And all of us can do our part to change people, how we view people with addiction in the United States. So when you see someone with an addiction, don't think of a drunk or a junkie or an addict or an abuser. See a person. Offer them help. Give them kindness and compassion. And together, we can be part of a growing movement in the United States to change how we view people with addiction. Together, we can change public policy. We can ensure that people get care when they need it, just like any other disease.
So some good parallels there and examples to other diseases as well as other movements. So movements for HIV, for example, a little inspiring that the movements to change the care around people with HIV did change, and a lot of people were able to get care, and how changing the stigma around it can help with that. There's also a lot that can be done in individual communities. At a community level, it's probably a lot easier than changing things at a national level to help people with addictions and see those things as diseases and making sure to get people the care that they need at a city or a county or a state level. Might be a little easier to do than at a national level. So something to think about, a different perspective than you might have thought of in the past. Another video that's not directly related to that, but also is related to the services that early adults have access to. Let's talk about mental health access, or access to mental health services as well.
Something to really know, or that really scared me when I first started transitioning, is that I was scared that all these supports I had were just gonna suddenly disappear. That now that I'm adult, I'm supposed to kind of deal with my own problems, and that I had to do that alone and independently. And I just didn't feel strong enough, or like I was ready to just take that all on. But the thing is, don't be scared of that responsibility, because it really lets you take control of your mental health and decide, how am I going to approach this? How am I going to be able to make myself better? And that's an amazing feeling, just being able to take something that's haunted you for what may be years and just taking that control back and saying, this is what I can do.
So the point there is that as this transition is happening from emerging adulthood or into emerging adulthood or into early adulthood, whichever term you want to use, a lot of people are taking the responsibility for their own physical care, like primary care doctors, or mental health care, onto their own shoulders. So as an example, I had a friend who was in treatment for depression, and so they had been on a specific medicine for multiple years as an adolescent. So their parent had found them this therapist. I don't remember if they were seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but in either case, they were diagnosed in medicine. And then they just kept on with that person for about a year after they had moved out of their parents' house. And then at that point, their friend was like, well, you should maybe look for another therapist if you don't like that medicine, or talk to your therapist about changing the medicine. And so they decided that they did, in the end, want to keep that same therapist. But they did look into the drug that they were using, looking at other options that were available that they thought might work better for them. And they went and they talked to their therapist about changing the drug that they were on. And that new drug that they ended up trying ended up working really well for this friend of mine. So they felt really good and empowered by the fact that they now had that control. And it can be difficult to make that step. There's not a lot of maybe resources to help young adults to make that step. And how do you set a doctor's appointment? It might sound silly to some people, but how do you do that? How do you go about finding a doctor for the problems that you have, to change mental health care providers? If you move, what do you do? Are you now too far away from this provider? What about insurances? All those things can be difficult to now navigate. So as you're taking on those responsibilities yourself. So what we can do is help support emerging adults and maybe create some tools, even apps or something that can help in that process to understand those transitions. All right, so let's jump back to these slides. So let's talk about some other health factors in early adulthood. So let's talk about sexuality briefly. We've talked about this the last couple physical development chapters. So you'll see this as another consistent thing as we move on. So compare this to what you learned in adolescence and even at what we learned in middle adulthood and beyond. So at about the age of 18, about 60% of people have experienced sexual intercourse. At around the age of 25, most people have. So it's close to 100% at that point. So casual sex is more common in the early 20s rather than the late 20s. So the numbers for early adults are about a third have sex twice a week or more, about a third have sex a few times a month, and then a third have sex a few times a year or not at all. So that's about the breakdown. Additionally, studies on sexual behaviors of early adults show that married and cohabitating couples have sex more often than non-cohabitating couples. Preference for sexual acts is about 96% rated vaginal sex as very or somewhat appealing, versus second place was watching a partner undress as a sexual act, and then the third was oral sex. So adultery isn't super common in early adulthood either. So about 75% of married men and 85% of married women reported that they were faithful. Again, that can be, honestly, any sexual behavior study can have the problem of people lying. There's a little less lying for early adults and middle adults and late adults than there are for adolescents, especially early adolescents. But there could still be problems if you're asking someone about their faithfulness, if they're worried that those kind of results are not going to be kept secure and confidential, they might lie, for example. So that could be one of those stats that might be off a little bit. You never know. So 54% of men said they thought about sex every day, and 67% of women said they thought about sex a few times a week. The overall conclusion of one study in 1994, I think this is kind of a really funny conclusion to come to in a scientific paper, was basically that Americans are a lot more conservative about their sexual behaviors than the researchers expected them to be. So going and reading that kind of paper as trying to make that comment, like they were essentially surprised about how conservative Americans were in their sexual behaviors. It's kind of a funny thing to read in a scientific paper. So with that, a 2017 study linked sexual activity to well-being. So well-being there's a couple different types of well-being. So I'm almost going to go into a tangent on well-being. We don't need to do that. It's more than just happiness. It also includes health and things like that. Meaning in life, those kinds of things. Anyway, so higher reported sexual pleasure and intimacy predicted more positive affect, so that's like those positive emotions, and less negative affect the next day. So more positive emotions, less negative emotions the next day. So sexual orientation and behaviors. So this again is one of those consistent things that you'll see development with as we go along in age range. So 3 to 7% of U.S. adults report being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transsexual. So sexual orientation is a continuum. I feel like we've talked about this a couple times in the last chapters, so we won't dive into it in too much depth. There's a couple specific facts that are relevant for this time period, though, in early adulthood. So let's jump forward to that. So one finding is that lesbians tend to have fewer sexual partners and have less permissive attitudes about casual sex than gay men in early adulthood. Some of the biggest differences are actually in the context of the relationships. So finding partners can be more difficult, discrimination, so that's in comparison to opposite sex partnerships. So STIs are primarily contracted through sex, so primarily through intercourse, but it can also be through oral genital or anal genital sex. So HIV is the biggest concern globally. We just talked about that in the video there. So with that, half of new infections are in the 15 to 24-year-old age range, so adolescents and early adults, and so that is a statistic worldwide. So HIV is really problematic because it destroys the immune system, making it really susceptible to a lot of other infections. So effective strategies are some of the things that we've already talked about. Comprehensive sexual education, knowing a risk status and that of your partner, obtaining medical examinations frequently, having protected sex, and not having sex with multiple partners, or making sure that those partners are tested and you're tested regularly as well. So your book has a lot of other detail on other STIs, so I'm not going to go into them. I'm not going to dive into them in detail in this lecture, but definitely things to be aware of. Read over these sections in the book, or just pause the presentation now and read over them now so that you're aware of these. All right, so let's jump forward out of physical development and jump into cognitive development for early adulthood. So again, we'll mention Piaget. So Piaget had some interesting ideas about adolescents and adults. With his observations, he thought that adolescents and adults were processing thoughts, were using their cognition in the same way, that they processed information the same. So he called it formal operations, so formal operational thought, and that started about age 11 to age 15, and that was still the place that early adults were also in. So at that point, people are able to think logically, reason abstractly, they're more idealistic, but thought there was essentially no change in people's cognition. That your knowledge about subjects could grow, but the way you are thinking, you're doing your cognition, was the same. So, more recent researchers have suggested, well, maybe there's another stage called post-formal thought. So this might be a new stage or a new way to look at it, that we're more reflective, relativistic, and contextual in early adulthood. So what that means is kind of similar to relational developmental systems theory, that multiple contexts can affect how one individual is changing and developing over time. As early adults are recognizing different context effects on them, different contexts might help them think in different ways. So they might realize that their work is a really important factor to their situation with their relationship with their partner, but also their school is, but also their partner's relationship with their family. And so they think about it in these different ways and weigh those in different ways. So it's a little more reflective and relativistic. So some suggest that this should be a new addition to these ideas. So Piaget's last was formal operational thought. More recent researchers suggest maybe post-formal thought. And I think those are these processes of reflecting, being relativistic and contextual, those are definitely happening more in early adulthood. The research is clear on that. To call it another stage, I think we've talked enough about stage-like development that you might see why I might be uncomfortable with talking about that as a brand new stage. Because this is possible to learn earlier than early adulthood. An adolescent could learn how to think more relativistically and contextually, and might already be doing that. and some might not. Some early adults might not be thinking this way. So these are different specific cognitive skills. So thinking about them as different cognitive skills, I think, is a more useful thing. And any one of those skills might develop in a stage-like manner or in a more continuous manner. So with that, young adults, early adults, tend to be a little more pragmatic than adolescents than they were early on in adolescence. So recognize that their emotions are having an effect on their cognition. So this is a lot easier as the myelination finishes in the prefrontal cortex, realizing and recognizing that those emotions are helping drive some of those thoughts and ideas that are happening. So let's talk about creativity. On average, most people's most creative work is done in their 30s. So if you're almost there, you can look forward to that. If you're in your 30s, that's great. If you're maybe past your 30s, maybe prove these statistics wrong, because again, these are on average, right? So we tend to get less and less creative after age 50, but we'll talk about some things that can increase your creativity, and they still work even into late adulthood. So it really depends on the specific field you are creative in as well. So depending on what you're trying to be creative in, you might be more creative later on in life or a little earlier in life. Just on average, it's about the 30s. So being open to new experience is really correlated to things like creativity in the arts, but there's more than just creativity in the arts. That's not the only thing that we're talking about. One example is a lot of what I do is research. And so with research methods, you're trying to learn things from people, combine different research methods and tools in ways to solve problems or get around things. So if there's suddenly if you have a hard time getting at a specific population, you might need to think of creative ways to do that. So that's one area where I use creativity in my research, or putting together studies in different or slightly unusual ways that are more creative. So that's not the same thing as when I go and do photography or attempt to draw something or something like that, right? I'm still using creativity, but in that specific field of doing research. So intellectual capacity is also very correlated to creativity in the sciences. So how do we get more creative? Well, being open to new experiences. So trying to expose yourself to new ideas, new art, new literature, take another course. So there was a student that, because of one of their requirements, they decided to take a electrical engineering course, and they were taking one of my courses at the same time. And as they did that, that was a new kind of thing to them, electrical engineering. I'm not sure now what requirement that fit for them, but anyway, that's not the point. The point is, when they saw how the circuits, the electrical circuits, were put together and how they worked, how you could put, I don't know enough about electrical engineering to describe it well enough. Essentially, it reminded them a lot of how neurons work. And so they had a lot better understanding of neurons and neurology, and it made them more excited. It gave them creative ways to think about that. So if they became more of an expert in either of those areas, neurology or electrical engineering, they could have thought of other creative ways around specific problems that I, for example, wouldn't have thought of. So opening yourself up to new kinds of things. Trying something different. So trying to go someplace new, or learning from someone else, learning from someone outside the sphere of influence that you've been aware of. An example of that for me is a lot of my research is in psychology, sociology, political science, in its relation to heroism. But whistleblowing specifically for heroism, there's a lot of literature in the business world and economics. And so I've more recently been reading a lot from economics journals about whistleblowers and things like HR and IO psychology, of how to manage organizations to either support or even suppress. Some of the papers are about that, about how to suppress whistleblowers. So learning from that different perspective has given me other insights that I wouldn't have had if I had stayed in that sphere that I was in. So write down things that surprise you every day. So that can be little things or big things. It can be relative to your sphere of expertise or not. And follow anything that sparks your interest. So as an example, I was watching just some random YouTube video and someone mentioned an app about how to learn that helped them learn a new language. So I was like, oh, that's interesting to me. So I downloaded the app and now I'm on like a 90 something day streak on Duolingo of trying to learn French. So that should help me be more creative, or maybe waste time in a way that seems more useful at least. So do things that make you feel creative. So at least that makes me feel creative, even if it's not actually helping at all. I've tried to watch a couple French videos or movies, and I do not know enough yet to be able to do that. So this is also related. Creativity is related a lot to optimal experience, of which one of those things is flow. So let's watch this short video about flow, and then we'll talk about it in more detail.
In less than 5 minutes, I promise. It was the first game of the 1992 NBA Championship Series. The Portland Trail Blazers were pulling ahead of the Chicago Bulls when Phil Jackson called a timeout. Michael Jordan emerged from this timeout with a sense of intense concentration. And though it didn't seem like a big deal at the time, he would then go on in the next 18 minutes to hit 6 three-pointers. At one point, he looked to the sidelines and shrugged his shoulders, seemingly surprised by his own success. He later described this experience as being in the zone. Now, players in every sport describe this similar experience of being in the zone, where they tune out the crowd and the noise and the distractions and just play at their top performance. But it isn't limited to sports. Artists and authors, musicians, engineers, composers, they all experience this same sense of being in the zone. It's a strange paradox where time seems to stand still, and yet it seems to be over in an instant. It feels effortless even though you're facing an extreme challenge. There's a sense of relaxation, but it's also intense. You seem more present than ever, but you also seem to lose your entire sense of self. You've probably experienced this before, when you were so engaged in a task that you lost track of time and place. There's a term for this. It's called being in a state of flow. And if we want students to be fully empowered to own the creative process, to engage in deep and meaningful work, well, then we need to understand what it means for students to reach this state of flow. Although the idea of flow has existed for thousands of years, flow theory began in the 1970s and 80s when Hungarian psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi became fascinated by artists who were so lost in their creative work that they would lose track of time and even ignore food, water, and sleep. And through his research, he noticed a similar experience with scientists and athletes and authors and all kinds of people who engaged in meaningful work. It was a state of hyper-focus and complete engagement, and he described it as optimal experience. Researchers do not have one single working model for flow theory, but there are a few factors that the theorists have described as being vital for achieving the state of flow. Number one, it needs to be a task that you find intrinsically rewarding. You're not going to hit a state of flow while necessarily, mowing the yard or cleaning toilets, unless that's your jam. Number two, you need clear goals and a sense of progress. It helps if you are actually setting the goals yourself. Number three, the task needs clear and immediate feedback. You need to know what you're doing and where you're going. Number four, the challenge must match the perceived skills. This requires a sense of personal control or agency over the task. In 1987, researchers published the 8-channel model of flow shown here, and notice that if a task is too easy, you might experience apathy or boredom, but if a task seems too hard, you'll be anxious. The goal is to match both the skill level and the task at hand. And number 5, it requires intense focus on the present moment. So, what does this actually mean for schools? Well, here are a few ideas. Number 1, tap into intrinsic motivation. Find tasks that students will want to do rather than tasks that they simply have to do. Number 2,
So while this is from the perspective of what a school can do to do this, you can think of this in your own life as either an early adult, adolescent, or middle adult, or later on as well. So thinking about things that intrinsically motivate you that you could then find yourself in a state of flow for. I'll give a couple more examples once the video is done, but while this is focused on students, this can apply to other areas outside of just academic, structured student teacher systems.
embrace student choice and agency. Whenever possible, allow them to own their learning. Number 3, provide the right scaffolding so that students can match the challenge level to their ability levels, or at least their perceived ability levels. Number 4, minimize distractions so that students can focus on their learning. It helps to change the pacing so that you have fewer tasks and more time to accomplish it. And number 5, help students learn to monitor their own progress through metacognition. Teach them to set goals, analyze tasks, figure out what they need to do, make adjustments in the moment, and reflect on their progress at hand.
All right, so that's a good video that briefly goes over flow. It does a pretty good job. It even gets Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's name right, so which is very rare. He was actually one of my professors at Claremont Graduate University, as well as Gene Nakamura, and it literally took me 2 semesters to get his name right. I just never said his name because I was afraid of saying it wrong, and he was such a big name in psychology, so I just didn't use his name. Professor, that worked, right? Anyway, so let's go over a example of this. So we heard the example of sports for finding yourself in flow. But also artists, musicians, engineers, scientists, anybody can find themselves in flow in any kind of state. I think it's really easy to understand, say, a physical challenge and getting into a flow state for that. So let's use an example of driving a race car, and that'll maybe become a little more obvious why this is relevant in a minute. And also let's talk about writing a paper. So for driving, or you could also insert riding a motorcycle in this case as well. So for driving or riding a motorcycle, to get into a state of flow, you have to have a couple different things. So you have to have, where's that part? A match of your skill level and the challenge level. And same if you're going to find yourself in a state of flow when learning a piece of music or, say, writing a paper. So riding a motorcycle or writing a paper. That's funny. Maybe only a little bit though. So let's look at the example of riding a motorcycle. When I first was learning to ride a motorcycle, my skill level was obviously very low. You might argue that my skill level is still low after years of riding a motorcycle. But the point is, my skill level was low and the challenge was very high. So I was very anxious about it. So there's courses to take that can help you learn and whatnot. I didn't take any of those. I just wanted to do it on my own. So I was very anxious. It was a hard time. I was not in a state of flow. I was in a state of anxiety. As I got a little better, I was in a state of worry. I got to a high enough skill level that the challenge of riding around an empty parking lot was appropriate. And then I started to get into a place where I was maybe in the arousal or flow area. So again, flow is that state where you are forgetting the things that are, well, you're not forgetting. You feel a sense of lost time. You're so engrossed and so engaged in an activity, it seems like your experience is very slow, but all of a sudden it's over. You are super focused. It's an enjoyable experience. So it's not something that is stressful or anxiety ridden. It is highly intense because you are matching your challenge and skill level. but it's not over challenging. When it gets too challenging, it moves back here to this arousal or anxiety or worry when it's too challenging. So, as an example, when I got to that point, riding around a parking lot was very enjoyable then at that point, and then I could move on to the streets, where again, anxiety was the thing again. So now I'm riding a motorcycle. You could think back to when you were learning to drive a car. It was really difficult. You probably were in a parking lot for the first little bit, then you started to move out to a road. And then once you started feeling comfortable, eventually you got to a point where maybe driving, or for me, even riding a motorcycle on just normal streets, I'm now very apathetic. I'm bored or apathetic about it because my skill level is higher than the challenge level. So, with that being said, I'm not recommending that you all try to go car racing on the streets, but there are things called track days. If you go to a track, you can then try and meet your challenge and skill level, and you can get then into that experience of flow. So let's take the other example of, well, let's use an example that I haven't mentioned at all yet, chess. So a lot of chess players, when they are playing against another player who's about their same skill level, maybe slightly better than them, will find themselves in a state of flow. Because they're matching that skill and challenge level. For me, one area in my work that I get into flow a lot is when I'm doing writing. So when I'm writing my dissertation or a paper or a book or something like that, when I'm able to sit down and focus on the task for a couple hours at a time, when I'm learning or incorporating new things or new data or interesting topics or trying to fix a problem in the paper, that's usually when I find myself in my own work in flow. So with that, I'm not in flow all the time when I'm doing work. And flow is not something that you really can be at every single moment of the day, right? So if you're going to take a shower, there's probably very little challenge in taking a shower, right? Unless something has happened, like you've broken your arm or something, so you now have a slightly higher challenge. But you're probably not going to be in a state of flow in that kind of situation, right? So, but in your work, whatever you're doing, or a hobby that you're interested in, whether it's chess, climbing, music, writing, a lot of these things where you can be engaged in it and you can focus on that task, get feedback on it, you can find yourself in flow. So let's look at some of these other points with these examples. So the basics, the contributing factors, it needs to be something intrinsically rewarding, something that you want to do. So wanting to ride a motorcycle, wanting to write a paper, those are things that I want to do. Clear goals and a sense of progress. So one thing for riding a motorcycle or playing chess, so you can see very easily that you're increasing skills up to a certain point, right? So if I went to a track and had maybe a coach teaching me how to ride a motorcycle better, I could get clear goals and a sense of progress. If you had a mentor teaching you chess or teaching you how to write or teaching you some other skill, you could set clear goals and see that you're checking those off. Another thing is getting really clear and immediate feedback. So for learning to drive a car, you get pretty clear and immediate feedback when you're pushing on the brake and the gas, because you're juddering around and then you start to get smoother and smoother. The feedback for that is pretty immediate. For writing a paper, it's maybe a little harder to get that really clear and immediate feedback. So those are things you can build in to help yourself get into flow. So clear and immediate feedback for playing chess or climbing or things like that. Some of those will be easier than others. Matching that challenge and skill, I think I've given a couple good examples of that. Another good example of this is actually a lot of video games try to get people into a state of flow. So for example, a lot of multiplayer online games will try to match you up with people who are at about your skill level. And their purpose is, well, if you're matched up and you get to be in that state of flow, then you're enjoying it, you're intrinsically motivated, you stay in the game for a long time because you're losing that sense of time, you're hyper-focused. The longer you're in the game, the more likely you are to maybe buy the next game or buy things like loot boxes or extra perks in the game. So with that, they want to match you up with people about your same skill level, so that then in the end you'll spend more money. But essentially they're using this match of challenge and skill to get you in a state of flow so you'll play more, which is a good thing, like having that positive experience. So video games are another area where they on their own try to match your challenge and skill. A normal storied game will often have, I'm thinking, maybe not a great example to bring up because probably only a few of you have played it, but Titanfall 2 is a really good example of building on your skills throughout even the normal levels of the game, so that at the end you have these big challenges, but your skills are also matched there. So it's trying to keep you in a state of flow throughout the story, as well as trying to match you up if you're playing online with other people around your same skill level. Because if you're playing with people that are too difficult, you're going to get frustrated and not want to play anymore. If it's too easy, then you're going to get bored. So that goes back to this diagram here. If you're matching that skill level, you'll be in flow. If not, you might be bored or apathetic. So the last one is having intense focus on the present. So with that, making sure that you're in a state where you can focus on that task. So for me, it's writing. For you, whatever that thing that you would want to get into flow with, racing a car or racing a motorcycle, go to a track day, have the times set so that you can do that. Whatever skill it is, you can get into that state of flow because it is an enjoyable, optimal experience, something that we enjoy doing. And it will also help you challenge yourself and get better at things. So, what are some other examples that you can think of activities that you could do to get into a flow state? So think of your own life, of things that you might do, times that you have been in that state of flow, that you've been really engaged, where your skill and challenge are matched, where you've lost time but you've really enjoyed what you've been doing and you've been really hyper-focused. So another question that this was asked in that class with Gene Nakamura and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, they asked us to do something in the next week that would get us into a flow state. And I thought, well, you could get a flow state by, say, going to a track day. I couldn't afford that. So I was like, well, I could try braking in my car with my left foot. So left foot braking is a technique that some racing drivers sometimes use. So I could practice that. And it would give me immediate feedback. It would be something that it would be challenging for me, so I could maybe meet that challenge and skill level. So that was something that I did to try and get into flow in that week. They felt a little uncomfortable when I wrote about it, because they're like, was that actually safe? But apparently it was enough. I didn't have any accidents. Only accidents I've ever been in, I've been rear-ended, so that's not fun. But that's a totally different topic. All right, so jumping forward in socio-emotional or in cognition to careers and work for early adults. So there are developmental changes. In childhood, generally children think about careers in an idealistic way. But as we see with cognitive changes, early adults probably won't think about them as idealistically anymore, probably a little more pragmatically. So even though you might want to do XYZ, well, maybe this is a route to get to XYZ, or maybe XYZ is now a hobby, but pragmatically, maybe you'll do this because it'll get you more money or something like that. Adolescents, we're generally exploring different career possibilities with identity. That does extend into emerging adulthood as well. And oftentimes in early adulthood, we're choosing a major or specialization, some specific area of work. Then in middle adulthood, we're generally working in that field, trying to advance. Oftentimes, near the end of middle adulthood, a career might even change. So careers and finding purpose. So purpose in life, and we've mentioned this a couple times. A purpose is a stable and generalized intention that's meaningful to yourself. So a stable set of stable goals that are meaningful to yourself, but are also relevant to people beyond you. So relevant to the world at large, relevant to, say, a family. So we have that goals, meaning, and self-transcendence, that beyond the self aspects. So let's talk about careers and finding purpose. So some of the main researchers who started looking into purpose felt like a lot of adolescents and early adults kind of drift aimlessly through high school and the college years, but that if they found a purpose in life, that they might be more focused. They'd be able to pick their careers quicker. They'd feel better about themselves because of it. And we do see that people who do have a purpose have more healthy identity development, more meaningful academic experience. If you know this is for a specific purpose, then these things you're learning in this random class might be more relevant. Helps you foster connections with other people that feel that thing is important as well. Helps you be more resilient when challenges come. So about 20% of high school students on average have purpose, and about 30% of college age participants have purpose. And it doesn't really grow too much higher into middle adulthood. We generally find about less than 50% of people have a purpose in life that they feel is really solid, which is a little unfortunate, which is one of the aspects of my work that I try to do, is increase people's purpose because it does have those positive benefits. It's more intrinsically motivating. It helps people set long-term goals, those kinds of things. So parents and teachers often focus on people getting good grades, but don't necessarily focus on the purpose behind getting those good grades, behind doing well in something. So if doing well in a history class means you can do better or get into a better school to then get this specific kind of position that you want in the future, that is how a purpose might be tied to, say, some random history class as an example. So that one's not actually relevant. So with that, work is a place where a lot of early adults spend a lot of times. It influences their relationships, their financial standing, their housing, their free time. So where you work in emerging adulthood or early adulthood can be a really important context for a lot of other aspects of your development. So early adults average about 47 hours a week at work. And with that, long-term employment prospects are disappearing. And what I mean by that is my father-in-law, as an example, he worked for a company for essentially his entire career. After college, he got into their company. He stayed with that company even after it was sold to or absorbed into another company. But he stayed in the same 2 buildings from this company his entire career. But that kind of thing is not happening as often now. So that can lead to a lot of things like stress for early adults in the context now. A lot of workers want more control and flexibility of their time and their goals. They want to have those experiences of flow. They want to be intrinsically motivated as they're working. So unemployment at this time, and at any time really, can be incredibly stressful. It's really correlated highly with heart attack, stroke, depression, anxiety, marital difficulties. So with that, it affects a lot of contexts in life. So as a context, we're talking about community, society, culture as these big ones, your social network and school network, parent network, marriage network, and work network. These are all different contexts that can affect a lot of your life. If you're unemployed, you might be spending all your time looking for employment. It might be harder to purchase nutritious foods, and that's going to impact your health even more. So important things to consider for researchers and for policymakers for emerging adults. So individuals who cope best with unemployment have financial resources to rely on, savings, or the earnings of other family members. So this was either a statement from the book or a paper that I thought was one of those things that's really obvious that sometimes you find in research papers that it's well, of course, people who do best with unemployment are people who have money to fall back on. It's of course that's who would do best. So just kind of a funny thing I wanted to point out from some research. But other things that do help with unemployment and supporting people are emotional support. Having family members who are adaptable, maybe they need to help with childcare or help support you in looking for a job while they're taking on their responsibilities. Getting job counseling, so help in writing resume or doing interview skills building, things like that. Self-help groups can also shown a lot of help for people who are unemployed. So with that, work can also affect the family and early adults in other ways. So dual earner couples are a unique context that's a lot more recent in recent decades, with more people in the household needing to work to just barely survive and scrape by. So it can be difficult balancing that work and home life, especially in early adulthood, if you are partnered with another early adult who might have 2 or 3 jobs, even with a variety of schedules per week. So your sleep schedule might be different than theirs. The time that you're both home together might be different. That can be difficult. And then children can add to that difficulty as well. They need to go to school or daycare at specific times, paying for those things. So all these contexts can add up to additional stress, but also additional things like more purpose and happiness as well. So egalitarian partnerships are best. So in most partnerships, even today, on average, women still do the majority of household tasks. So even if 2 partners, say a man and a woman, are partnered and they are earning the same amount of money, working the same amount of hours, on average, the woman is still doing the majority of the household tasks. So that's definitely something that could change. Being more egalitarian is better. Planning skills are definitely essential for success in this kind of situation with dual earner couples. And that is the last little bit that we have for chapter 11. I know we only touched on some of these topics really quickly, and a few that were only barely touched on in the book we dove into in a lot of depth. So make sure that you're going over your book and getting the depth that they have there. I really wanted to focus on some things like flow today, for example, to get a little more depth that I think is relevant to you students particularly, that could help you in your own life. So we'll jump to chapter 12 next time.